I have entered upon a performance which is without example, whose accomplishment will have no imitator. I mean to present my fellow mortals with a man in all the integrity of nature, and this man shall be myself. I know my heart, and have studied mankind. I am not made like anyone I have been acquainted with, perhaps like no one in existence. If not better, I at least claim originality, and whether nature did wisely in breaking the mold with which she formed me, can only be determined after having read this work. Whenever the last trumpet shall sound, I will present myself before the sovereign judge with this book in my hand, and loudly proclaim, "Thus have I acted, these were my thoughts, such was I." With equal freedom and veracity have I related what was laudable or wicked. I have concealed no crimes, added no virtues, and if I have sometimes introduced superfluous ornament, it was merely to occupy a void occasioned by defect of memory. I may have supposed that certain, which I only knew to be probable, but have never asserted as truth, a conscious falsehood. Such as I was, I have declared myself, sometimes vile and despicable, at others, virtuous, generous and sublime, even as thou hast read my inmost soul, power eternal. Assemble round thy throne an innumerable throng of my fellow mortals, let them listen to my confessions, let them blush at my depravity, let them tremble at my sufferings, let each in his turn expose with equal sincerity the failings, the wanderings of his heart, and, if he dare, aver, I was better than that man. I was born at Geneva, in 1712, son of Isaac Rousseau and Susanna Bernard, citizens. My father's share of a moderate competency, which was divided among 15 children, being very trivial, his business of a watchmaker, in which he had the reputation of great ingenuity, was his only dependence. My mother's circumstances were more affluent. She was daughter of a Mons. Bernard, minister, and possessed a considerable share of modesty and beauty. Indeed, my father found some difficulty in obtaining her hand. The affection they entertained for each other was almost as early as their existence. At 8 or 9 years old they walked together every evening on the banks of the Trial, and before they were 10, could not support the idea of separation. A natural sympathy of soul confined those sentiments of predilection which habit at first produced. Born with minds susceptible of the most exquisite sensibility and tenderness, it was only necessary to encounter similar dispositions. That moment fortunately presented itself, and each surrendered a willing heart. The obstacles that opposed served only to give a degree of vivacity to their affection, and the young lover, not being able to obtain his mistress, was overwhelmed with sorrow and despair. She advised him to travel, to forget her. He consented. He traveled, but returned more passionate than ever, and had the happiness to find her equally constant, equally tender. After this proof of mutual affection, what could they resolve? To dedicate their future lives to love. The resolution was ratified with a vow, on which heaven shed its benediction. Fortunately, my mother's brother, Gabriel Bernard, fell in love with one of my father's sisters. She had no objection to the match, but made the marriage of his sister with her brother an indispensable preliminary. Love soon removed every obstacle, and the 2 weddings were celebrated the same day. Thus my uncle became the husband of my aunt, and their children were doubly cousins german. Before a year was expired, both had the happiness to become fathers, but were soon after obliged to submit to a separation. My uncle Bernard, who was an engineer, went to serve in the Empire in Hungary under Prince Eugene, and distinguished himself both at the siege and battle of Belgrade. My father, after the birth of my only brother, set off, on recommendation, for Constantinople, and was appointed watchmaker to the Seraglio. During his absence, the beauty, wit, and accomplishments of my mother attracted a number of admirers, among whom Mons de la Closure, resident of France, was the most assiduous in his attentions. They were too brilliant for her situation, the minister, her father, having bestowed great pains on her education. She was taught drawing, singing, and to play on the theorbo, had learning, and wrote very agreeable verses. The following is an extempore piece which she composed in the absence of her husband and brother, in a conversation with some person relative to them, while walking with her sister-in-law, and their 2 children. Cs du messers, que sont absents, nous sont chers de bien de manners, ce sont nos amis, nos amants, ce sont nos maris et nos frères, et il espères de ces enfants. These absent ones, who just claim our hearts, by every tender name, to whom each wish extends our husbands and our brothers are, the fathers of this blooming pair, our lovers and our friends. His passion must have been extremely violent, since after a period of 30 years I have seen him affected at the very mention of her name. My mother had a defense more powerful even than her virtue. She tenderly loved my father, and conjured him to return. His inclination seconding his request, he gave up every prospect of emolument, and hastened to Geneva. I was the unfortunate fruit of this return, being born 10 months after, in a very weakly and infirm state. My birth cost my mother her life, and was the first of my misfortunes. I am ignorant how my father supported her loss at that time, but I know he was ever after inconsolable. In me he still thought he saw her he so tenderly lamented, but could never forget I had been the innocent cause of his misfortune, nor did he ever embrace me, but his sighs, the convulsive pressure of his arms, witnessed that a bitter regret mingled itself with his caresses, though, as may be supposed, they were not on this account less ardent. When he said to me, "Jean-Jacques, let us talk of your mother," my usual reply was, "Yes, father, but then, we shall cry," and immediately the tears started from his eyes. "Ah," exclaimed he, with agitation, "give me back my wife, at least console me for her loss, fill up, dear boy, the void she has left in my soul. Could I love thee thus wert thou only my son?" 40 years after this loss he expired in the arms of his second wife, but the name of the first still vibrated on his lips, still was her image engraved on his heart. Such were the authors of my being. Of all the gifts it had pleased heaven to bestow on them, a feeling heart was the only one that descended to me. This had been the source of their felicity, it was the foundation of all my misfortunes. I came into the world with so few signs of life, that they entertained but little hope of preserving me, with the seeds of a disorder that has gathered strength with years, and from which I am now relieved at intervals, only to suffer a different, though more intolerable evil. I owed my preservation to one of my father's sisters, an amiable and virtuous girl, who took the most tender care of me. She is yet living, nursing, at the age of 80, a husband younger than herself, but worn out with excessive drinking. Dear aunt, I freely forgive your having preserved my life, and only lament that it is not in my power to bestow on the decline of your days the tender solicitude and care you lavished on the first dawn of mine. My nurse, Jacqueline, is likewise living, and in good health. The hands that opened my eyes to the light of this world may close them at my death. We suffer before we think, it is the common lot of humanity. I experienced more than my proportion of it. I have no knowledge of what passed prior to my 5th or 6th year. I recollect nothing of learning to read. I only remember what effect the first considerable exercise of it produced on my mind, and from that moment I date an uninterrupted knowledge of myself. Every night, after supper, we read some part of a small collection of romances which had been my mother's. My father's design was only to improve me in reading, and he thought these entertaining works were calculated to give me a fondness for it, but we soon found ourselves so interested in the adventures they contained, that we alternately read whole nights together, and could not bear to give over until at the conclusion of a volume. Sometimes, in a morning, on hearing the swallows at our window, my father, quite ashamed of this weakness, would cry, "Come, come, let us go to bed, I am more a child than thou art." I soon acquired, by this dangerous custom, not only an extreme facility in reading and comprehending, but, for my age, a too intimate acquaintance with the passions. An infinity of sensations were familiar to me. Without possessing any precise idea of the objects to which they related, I had conceived nothing, I had felt the whole. This confused succession of emotions did not retard the future efforts of my reason, though they added an extravagant, romantic notion of human life, which experience and reflection have never been able to eradicate. My romance reading concluded with the summer of 1719, the following winter was differently employed. My mother's library being quite exhausted, we had recourse to that part of her father's which had devolved to us. Here we happily found some valuable books, which was by no means extraordinary, having been selected by a minister that truly deserved that title, in whom learning, which was the rage of the times, was but a secondary commendation, his taste and good sense being most conspicuous. The History of the Church and Empire by Lesueur, Bossuet's Discourses on Universal History, Plutarch's Lives, The History of Venice by Nanny, Ovid's Metamorphoses, La Bruyère, Fontenelle's World, his Dialogues of the Dead, and a few volumes of Molière, were soon ranged in my father's closet, where, during the hours he was employed in his business, I daily read them, with an avidity and taste uncommon, perhaps unprecedented at my age. Plutarch presently became my greatest favorite. The satisfaction I derived from repeated readings I gave this author extinguished my passion for romances, and I shortly preferred Agesilaus, Brutus, and Aristides to Orondates, Artamenes, and Juba. These interesting studies, seconded by the conversations they frequently occasioned with my father, produced that republican spirit and love of liberty, that haughty and invincible turn of mind, which rendered me impatient of restraint or servitude, and became the torment of my life, as I continually found myself in situations incompatible with these sentiments. Incessantly occupied with Rome and Athens, conversing, if I may so express myself, with their illustrious heroes, born the citizen of a republic, of a father whose ruling passion was a love of his country, I was fired with these examples, could fancy myself a Greek or Roman, and readily give into the character of the personage whose life I read. Transported by the recital of any extraordinary instance of fortitude or intrepidity, animation flashed from my eyes, and gave my voice additional strength and energy. One day, at table, while relating the fortitude of Scoebula, they were terrified at seeing me start from my seat and hold my hand over a hot chafing dish, to represent more forcibly the action of that determined Roman. My brother, who was 7 years older than myself, was brought up to my father's profession. The extraordinary affection they lavished on me might be the reason he was too much neglected. This certainly was a fault which cannot be justified. His education and morals suffered by this neglect, and he acquired the habits of a libertine before he arrived at an age to be really one. My father tried what effect placing him with a master would produce, but he still persisted in the same ill conduct. Though I saw him so seldom that it could hardly be said we were acquainted, I loved him tenderly, and believe he had as strong an affection for me as a youth of his dissipated turn of mind could be supposed capable of. One day, I remember, when my father was correcting him severely, I threw myself between them, embracing my brother, whom I covered with my body. Receiving the strokes designed for him, I persisted so obstinately in my protection, that either softened by my cries and tears, or fearing to hurt me most, his anger subsided, and he pardoned his fault. In the end, my brother's conduct became so bad that he suddenly disappeared, and we learned some time after that he was in Germany, but he never wrote to us, and from that day we heard no news of him. Thus I became an only son. If this poor lad was neglected, it was quite different with his brother, for the children of a king could not be treated with more attention and tenderness than were bestowed on my infancy, being the darling of the family, and what is rather uncommon, though treated as a beloved, never a spoiled child, was never permitted, while under paternal inspection, to play in the street with other children, never had any occasion to contradict or indulge those fantastical humors which are usually attributed to nature, but are in reality the effects of an injudicious education. I had the faults common to my age, was talkative, a glutton, and sometimes a liar, made no scruple of stealing sweetmeats, fruits, or, indeed, any kind of eatables, but never took delight in mischievous waste, in accusing others, or tormenting harmless animals. I recollect, indeed, that one day, while Madame Clot, a neighbor of ours, was gone to church, I made water in her kettle. The remembrance even now makes me smile, for Madame Clot, though, if you please, a good sort of creature, was one of the most tedious grumbling old women I ever knew. Thus have I given a brief, but faithful, history of my childish transgressions. How could I become cruel or vicious, when I had before my eyes only examples of mildness, and was surrounded by some of the best people in the world? My father, my aunt, my nurse, my relations, our friends, our neighbors, all I had any connection with, did not obey me, it is true, but loved me tenderly, and I returned their affection. I found so little to excite my desires, and those I had were so seldom contradicted, that I was hardly sensible of possessing any, and can solemnly aver I was an absolute stranger to caprice until after I had experienced the authority of a master. Those hours that were not employed in reading or writing with my father, or walking with my governess, Jacqueline, I spent with my aunt, and whether seeing her embroider, or hearing her sing, whether sitting or standing by her side, I was ever happy. Her tenderness and unaffected gaiety, the charms of her figure and countenance have left such indelible impressions on my mind, that her manner, look, and attitude are still before my eyes. I recollect 1,000 little caressing questions, could describe her clothes, her headdress, nor have the 2 curls of fine black hair which hung on her temples, according to the mode of that time, escaped my memory. Though my taste, or rather passion, for music, did not show itself until a considerable time after, I am fully persuaded it is to her I am indebted for it. She knew a great number of songs, which she sung with great sweetness and melody. The serenity and cheerfulness which were conspicuous in this lovely girl banished melancholy, and made all round her happy. The charms of her voice had such an effect on me, that not only several of her songs have ever since remained on my memory, but some I have not thought of from my infancy, as I grow old, return upon my mind with a charm altogether inexpressible. Would anyone believe that an old dotard like me, worn out with care and infirmity, should sometimes surprise himself weeping like a child, and in a voice querulous, and broken by age, muttering out one of those airs which were the favorites of my infancy? There is one song in particular, whose tune I perfectly recollect, but the words that compose the latter half of it constantly refuse every effort to recall them, though I have a confused idea of the rhymes. The beginning, with what I have been able to recollect of the remainder, is as follows. Tersus, J nos ecodertun shalamo su el ormo, car on en cause deja don notre hamo. Un burger es engager sans danger, et toujours elapine est sans la rose. I have endeavored to account for the invincible charm my heart feels on the recollection of this fragment, but it is altogether inexplicable. I only know that before I get to the end of it, I always find my voice interrupted by tenderness, and my eyes suffused with tears. I have 100 times formed the resolution of writing to Paris for the remainder of these words, if anyone should chance to know them, but I am almost certain the pleasure I take in the recollection would be greatly diminished was I assured anyone but my poor Aunt Susan had sung them. Such were my affections on entering this life. Thus began to form and demonstrate itself, a heart, at once haughty and tender, a character effeminate, yet invincible, which, fluctuating between weakness and courage, luxury and virtue, has ever set me in contradiction to myself, causing abstinence and enjoyment, pleasure and prudence, equally to shun me. This course of education was interrupted by an accident, whose consequences influenced the rest of my life. My father had a quarrel with Emergy, who had a captain's commission in France, and was related to several of the council. This G, who was an insolent, ungenerous man, happening to bleed at the nose, in order to be revenged, accused my father of having drawn his sword on him in the city, and in consequence of this charge they were about to conduct him to prison. He insisted, according to the law of this republic, that the accuser should be confined at the same time, and not being able to obtain this, preferred a voluntary banishment for the remainder of his life, to giving up a point by which he must sacrifice his honor and liberty. I remained under the tuition of my uncle Bernard, who was at that time employed in the fortifications of Geneva. He had lost his eldest daughter, but had a son about my own age, and we were sent together to Bossy, to board with the minister Lambercier. Here we were to learn Latin, with all the insignificant trash that has obtained the name of education. 2 years spent in this village softened, in some degree, my Roman fierceness, and again reduced me to a state of childhood. At Geneva, where nothing was exacted, I loved reading, which was, indeed, my principal amusement, but, at Bossy, where application was expected, I was fond of play as a relaxation. The country was so new, so charming in my idea, that it seemed impossible to find satiety in its enjoyments, and I conceived a passion for rural life, which time has not been able to extinguish, nor have I ever ceased to regret the pure and tranquil pleasures I enjoyed at this place in my childhood, the remembrance having followed me through every age, even to that in which I am hastening again towards it. M. Lambercier was a worthy, sensible man, who, without neglecting our instruction, never made our acquisitions burthensome, or tasks tedious. What convinces me of the rectitude of his method is, that notwithstanding my extreme aversion to restraint, the recollection of my studies is never attended with disgust, and, if my improvement was trivial, it was obtained with ease, and has never escaped memory. The simplicity of this rural life was of infinite advantage in opening my heart to the reception of true friendship. The sentiments I had hitherto formed on this subject were extremely elevated, but altogether imaginary. The habit of living in this peaceful manner soon united me tenderly to my cousin Bernard. My affection was more ardent than that I had felt for my brother, nor has time ever been able to efface it. He was a tall, lank, weakly boy, with a mind as mild as his body was feeble, and who did not wrong the good opinion they were disposed to entertain for the son of my guardian. Our studies, amusements, and tasks were the same. We were alone, each wanted a playmate. To separate would in some measure have been to annihilate us. Though we had not many opportunities of demonstrating our attachment to each other, it was certainly extreme, and so far from enduring the thought of separation, we could not even form an idea that we should ever be able to submit to it. Each of a disposition to be won by kindness, and complaisant, when not soured by contradiction, we agreed in every particular. If, by the favor of those who governed us, he had the ascendant while in their presence, I was sure to acquire it when we were alone, and this preserved the equilibrium so necessary in friendship. If he hesitated in repeating his task, I prompted him. When my exercises were finished, I helped to write his, and, in our amusements, my disposition being most active, ever had the lead. In a word, our characters accorded so well, and the friendship that subsisted between us was so cordial, that during the 5 years we were at Bossy and Geneva we were inseparable. We often fought, it is true, but there never was any occasion to separate us. No one of our quarrels lasted more than a quarter of an hour, and never in our lives did we make any complaint of each other. It may be said, these remarks are frivolous, but, perhaps, a similar example among children can hardly be produced. The manner in which I passed my time at Bossy was so agreeable to my disposition, that it only required a longer duration absolutely to have fixed my character, which would have had only peaceable, affectionate, benevolent sentiments for its basis. I believe no individual of our kind ever possessed less natural vanity than myself. At intervals, by an extraordinary effort, I arrived at sublime ideas, but presently sunk again into my original languor. To be loved by everyone who knew me was my most ardent wish. I was naturally mild, my cousin was equally so, and those who had the care of us were of similar dispositions. Everything contributed to strengthen those propensities which nature had implanted in my breast, and during the 2 years I was neither the victim nor witness of any violent emotions. I knew nothing so delightful as to see everyone content, not only with me, but all that concerned them. When repeating our catechism at church, nothing could give me greater vexation, on being obliged to hesitate, than to see Miss Lambercier's countenance express disapprobation and uneasiness. This alone was more afflicting to me than the shame of faltering before so many witnesses, which, notwithstanding, was sufficiently painful, for though not over-solicitous of praise, I was feelingly alive to shame, yet I can truly affirm, the dread of being reprimanded by Miss Lambercier alarmed me less than the thought of making her uneasy. Neither she nor her brother were deficient in a reasonable severity, but as this was scarce ever exerted without just cause, I was more afflicted at their disapprobation than the punishment. Certainly the method of treating youth would be altered if the distant effects this indiscriminate, and frequently indiscreet method produces, were more conspicuous. I would willingly excuse myself from a further explanation, did not the lesson this example conveys, which points out an evil as frequent as it is pernicious, forbid my silence. As Miss Lambercier felt a mother's affection, she sometimes exerted a mother's authority, even to inflicting on us when we deserved it, the punishment of infants. She had often threatened it, and this threat of a treatment entirely new, appeared to me extremely dreadful, but I found the reality much less terrible than the idea, and what is still more unaccountable, this punishment increased my affection for the person who had inflicted it. All this affection, aided by my natural mildness, was scarcely sufficient to prevent my seeking, by fresh offences, a return of the same chastisement, for a degree of sensuality had mingled with the smart and shame, which left more desire than fear of a repetition. I was well convinced the same discipline from her brother would have produced a quite contrary effect, but from a man of his disposition this was not probable, and if I abstained from meriting correction it was merely from a fear of offending Miss Lambercier, for benevolence, aided by the passions, has ever maintained an empire over me which has given law to my heart. This event, which, though desirable, I had not endeavored to accelerate, arrived without my fault, I should say, without my seeking, and I profited by it with a safe conscience, but this second was also the last time, for Miss Lambercier, who doubtless had some reason to imagine this chastisement did not produce the desired effect, declared it was too fatiguing, and that she renounced it for the future. Till now we had slept in her chamber, and during the winter, even in her bed, but 2 days after another room was prepared for us, and from that moment I had the honor, which I could very well have dispensed with, of being treated by her as a great boy. Who would believe this childish discipline, received at 8 years old, from the hands of a woman of 30, should influence my propensities, my desires, my passions, for the rest of my life, and that in quite a contrary sense from what might naturally have been expected? The very incident that inflamed my senses, gave my desires such an extraordinary turn, that, confined to what I had already experienced, I sought no further, and, with blood boiling with sensuality, almost from my birth, preserved my purity beyond the age when the coldest constitutions lose their insensibility. Long tormented, without knowing by what, I gazed on every handsome woman with delight. Imagination incessantly brought their charms to my remembrance, only to transform them into so many Miss Lamberciers. If ever education was perfectly chaste, it was certainly that I received. My 3 aunts were not only of exemplary prudence, but maintained a degree of modest reserve which women have long since thought unnecessary. My father, it is true, loved pleasure, but his gallantry was rather of the last than the present century, and he never expressed his affection for any woman he regarded in terms a virgin could have blushed at. Indeed, it was impossible more attention should be paid to that regard we owe the morals of children than was uniformly observed by everyone I had any concern with. An equal degree of reserve in this particular was observed at M. Lambercier's, where a good maidservant was discharged for having once made use of an expression before us which was thought to contain some degree of indelicacy. I had no precise idea of the ultimate effect of the passions, but the conception I had formed was extremely disgusting. I entertained a particular aversion for courtesans, nor could I look on a rake without a degree of disdain mingled with terror. These prejudices of education, proper in themselves to retard the first explosions of a combustible constitution, were strengthened, as I have already hinted, by the effect the first moments of sensuality produced in me, for notwithstanding the troublesome ebullition of my blood, I was satisfied with the species of voluptuousness I had already been acquainted with, and sought no further. Thus I passed the age of puberty, with a constitution extremely ardent, without knowing or even wishing for any other gratification of the passions than what Miss Lambercier had innocently given me an idea of, and when I became a man, that childish taste, instead of vanishing, only associated with the other. This folly, joined to a natural timidity, has always prevented my being very enterprising with women, so that I have passed my days in languishing in silence for those I most admired, without daring to disclose my wishes. To fall at the feet of an imperious mistress, obey her mandates, or implore pardon, were for me the most exquisite enjoyments, and the more my blood was inflamed by the efforts of a lively imagination the more I acquired the appearance of a whining lover. It will be readily conceived that this mode of making love is not attended with a rapid progress or imminent danger to the virtue of its object, yet, though I have few favors to boast of, I have not been excluded from enjoyment, however imaginary. Thus the senses, in concurrence with a mind equally timid and romantic, have preserved my moral chaste, and feelings uncorrupted, with precisely the same inclinations, which, seconded with a moderate portion of effrontery, might have plunged me into the most unwarrantable excesses. I have made the first, most difficult step, in the obscure and painful maze of my confessions. We never feel so great a degree of repugnance in divulging what is really criminal, as what is merely ridiculous. I am now assured of my resolution, for after what I have dared disclose, nothing can have power to deter me. The difficulty attending these acknowledgments will be readily conceived, when I declare, that during the whole of my life, though frequently laboring under the most violent agitation, being hurried away with the impetuosity of a passion which, when in company with those I loved, deprived me of the faculty of sight and hearing, I could never, in the course of the most unbounded familiarity, acquire sufficient resolution to declare my folly, and implore the only favor that remained to bestow. In thus investigating the first traces of my sensible existence, I find elements, which, though seemingly incompatible, have united to produce a simple and uniform effect, while others, apparently the same, have, by the concurrence of certain circumstances, formed such different combinations, that it would never be imagined they had any affinity. Who would believe, for example, that one of the most vigorous springs of my soul was tempered in the identical source from whence luxury and ease mingled with my constitution and circulated in my veins? Before I quit this subject, I will add a striking instance of the different effects they produced. One day, while I was studying in a chamber contiguous to the kitchen, the maid set some of Miss Lambercier's combs to dry by the fire, and on coming to fetch them some time after, was surprised to find the teeth of one of them broken off. Who could be suspected of this mischief? No one but myself had entered the room. I was questioned, but denied having any knowledge of it. Mr. and Miss Lambercier consult, exhort, threaten, but all to no purpose. I obstinately persist in the denial, and, though this was the first time I had been detected in a confirmed falsehood, appearances were so strong that they overthrew all my protestations. This affair was thought serious. The mischief, the lie, the obstinacy, were considered equally deserving of punishment, which was not now to be administered by Miss Lambercier. My uncle Bernard was written to, he arrived, and my poor cousin being charged with a crime no less serious, we were conducted to the same execution, which was inflicted with great severity. If finding a remedy in the evil itself, they had sought ever to allay my depraved desires, they could not have chosen a shorter method to accomplish their designs, and, I can assure my readers, I was for a long time freed from the dominion of them. As this severity could not draw from me the expected acknowledgment, which obstinacy brought on several repetitions, and reduced me to a deplorable situation, yet I was immovable, and resolutely determined to suffer death rather than submit. Force, at length, was obliged to yield to the diabolical infatuation of a child, for no better name was bestowed on my constancy, and I came out of this dreadful trial, torn, it is true, but triumphant. 50 years have expired since this adventure. The fear of punishment is no more. Well, then, I aver, in the face of heaven, I was absolutely innocent, and, so far from breaking, or even touching the comb, never came near the fire. It will be asked, how did this mischief happen? I can form no conception of it, I only know my own innocence. Let anyone figure to himself a character whose leading traits were docility and timidity, but haughty, ardent, and invincible in its passions, a child, hitherto governed by the voice of reason, treated with mildness, equity, and complaisance, who could not even support the idea of injustice, experiencing, for the first time, so violent an instance of it, inflicted by those he most loved and respected. What perversion of ideas! What confusion in the heart, the brain, in all my little being, intelligent and moral! Let anyone, I say, if possible, imagine all this, for I am incapable of giving the least idea of what passed in my mind at that period. My reason was not sufficiently established to enable me to put myself in the place of others, and judge how much appearances condemned me. I only beheld the rigor of a dreadful chastisement, inflicted for a crime I had not committed, yet I can truly affirm, the smart I suffered, though violent, was inconsiderable compared to what I felt from indignation, rage, and despair. My cousin, who was almost in similar circumstances, having been punished for an involuntary fault as guilty of a premeditated crime, became furious by my example. Both in the same bed, we embraced each other with convulsive transport, we were almost suffocated, and when our young hearts found sufficient relief to breathe out our indignation, we sat up in the bed, and with all our force, repeated 100 times, Carnifex! 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 Executioner, tormentor. Even while I write this I feel my pulse quicken, and should I live 100,000 years, the agitation of that moment would still be fresh in my memory. The first instance of violence and oppression is so deeply engraved on my soul, that every relative idea renews my emotion. The sentiment of indignation, which in its origin had reference only to myself, has acquired such strength, and is at present so completely detached from personal motives, that my heart is as much inflamed at the sight or relation of any act of injustice, whatever may be the object, or wheresoever it may be perpetrated, as if I was the immediate sufferer. When I read the history of a merciless tyrant, or the dark and the subtle machination of a knavish designing priest, I could on the instant set off to stab the miscreants, though I was certain to perish in the attempt. I have frequently fatigued myself by running after and stoning a cock, a cow, a dog, or any animal I saw tormenting another, only because it was conscious of possessing superior strength. This may be natural to me, and I am inclined to believe it is, though the lively impression of the first injustice I became the victim of was too long and too powerfully remembered not to have added considerable force to it. This occurrence terminated my infantine serenity. From that moment I ceased to enjoy a pure unadulterated happiness, and on a retrospection of the pleasure of my childhood, I yet feel they ended here. We continue at Bossey some months after this event, but were like our first parents in the Garden of Eden after they had lost their innocence. In appearance our situation was the same, in effect it was totally different. Affection, respect, intimacy, confidence, no longer attached the pupils to their guides. We beheld them no longer as divinities, who could read the secrets of our hearts. We were less ashamed of committing faults, more afraid of being accused of them. We learned to dissemble, to rebel, to lie. All the vices common to our years began to corrupt our happy innocence, mingle with our sports, and embitter our amusements. The country itself, losing those sweet and simple charms which captivate the heart, appeared a gloomy desert, or covered with a veil that concealed its beauties. We cultivated our little gardens no more, our flowers were neglected. We no longer scratched away the mold, and broke out into exclamations of delight, on discovering that the grain we had sown began to shoot. We were disgusted with our situation, our preceptors were weary of us. In a word, my uncle wrote for our return, and we left Mr. and Miss Lambercier without feeling any regret at the separation. Near 30 years passed away from my leaving Bossey, without once recalling the place to my mind with any degree of satisfaction, but after having passed the prime of life, as I decline into old age, while more recent occurrences are wearing out apace, I feel these remembrances revive and imprint themselves on my heart, with a force and charm that every day acquires fresh strength, as if, feeling life fleet from me, I endeavored to catch it again by its commencement. The most trifling incident of those happy days delight me, for no other reason than being of those days. I recall every circumstance of time, place, and persons. I see the maid or footman busy in the chamber, a swallow entering the window, a fly settling on my hand while repeating my lessons. I see the whole economy of the apartment. On the right hand Mr. Lambercier's closet, with a print representing all the popes, a barometer, a large almanac, the windows of the house, which stood in a hollow at the bottom of the garden, shaded by raspberry shrubs, whose shoots sometimes found entrance. I am sensible the reader has no occasion to know all this, but I feel a kind of necessity for relating it. Why am I not permitted to recount all the little anecdotes of that thrice happy age, at the recollection of whose joys I ever tremble with delight? 5 or 6 particularly. Let us compromise the matter. I will give up 5, but then I must have one, and only one, provided I may draw it out to its utmost length, in order to prolong my satisfaction. If I only sought yours, I should choose that of Miss Lambercier's backside, which by an unlucky fall at the bottom of the meadow, was exposed to the view of the King of Sardinia, who happened to be passing by, but that of the walnut tree on the terrace is more amusing to me, since here I was an actor, whereas, in the above-mentioned scene I was only a spectator, and I must confess I see nothing that should occasion risibility in an accident, which, however laughable in itself, alarmed me for a person I loved as a mother, or perhaps something more. Ye curious readers, whose expectations are already on the stretch for the noble history of the terrace, listen to the tragedy, and abstain from trembling, if you can, at the horrible catastrophe. At the outside of the courtyard door, on the left hand, was a terrace. Here they often sat after dinner, but it was subject to one inconvenience, being too much exposed to the rays of the sun. To obviate this defect, Mr. Lambercier had a walnut tree set there, the planting of which was attended with great solemnity. The two boarders were godfathers, and while the earth was replacing round the root, each held the tree with one hand, singing songs of triumph. In order to water it with more effect, they formed a kind of luzin around its foot. Myself and cousin, who were everyday ardent spectators of this watering, confirmed each other in the very natural idea that it was nobler to plant trees on the terrace than colours on a breach, and this glory we were resolved to procure without dividing it with anyone. In pursuance of this resolution, we cut a slip off a willow, and planted it on the terrace, at about 8 or 10 feet distance from the august walnut tree. We did not forget to make a hollow round it, but the difficulty was how to procure a supply of water, which was brought from a considerable distance, and we not permitted to fetch it, but water was absolutely necessary for our willow, and we made use of every stratagem to obtain it. For a few days everything succeeded so well that it began to bud, and throw out small leaves, which we hourly measured, convinced, though now scarce a foot from the ground, it would soon afford us a refreshing shade. This unfortunate willow, by engrossing our whole time, rendered us incapable of application to any other study, and the cause of our inattention not being known, we were kept closer than before. The fatal moment approached when water must fail, and we were already afflicted with the idea that our tree must perish with drought. At length necessity, the parent of industry, suggested an invention, by which we might save our tree from death, and ourselves from despair. It was to make a furrow underground, which would privately conduct a part of the water from the walnut tree to our willow. This undertaking was executed with ardor, but did not immediately succeed. Our descent was not skillfully planned, the water did not run, the earth falling in and stopping up the furrow, yet, though all went contrary, nothing discouraged us, omnia vincit labor improbus. We made the basin deeper. To give the water a more sensible descent, we cut the bottom of a box into narrow planks, increased the channel from the walnut tree to our willow, and laying a row flat at the bottom, set two others inclining towards each other, so as to form a triangular channel. We formed a kind of grating with small sticks at the end next the walnut tree, to prevent the earth and stones from stopping it up, and having carefully covered our work with well-trodden earth, in a transport of hope and fear attended the hour of watering. After an interval, which seemed an age of expectation, this hour arrived. Mr. Lambercier, as usual, assisted at the operation. We contrived to get between him and our tree, towards which he fortunately turned his back. They no sooner began to pour the first pail of water, than we perceived it running to the willow. This sight was too much for our prudence, and we involuntarily expressed our transport by a shout of joy. The sudden exclamation made Mr. Lambercier turn about, though at that instant he was delighted to observe how greedily the earth, which surrounded the root of his walnut tree, imbibed the water. Surprised at seeing two trenches partake of it, he shouted in his turn, examines, perceives the roguery, and, sending instantly for a pickaxe, at one fatal blow makes 2 or 3 of our planks fly, crying out meantime with all his strength, "An aqueduct! An aqueduct!" His strokes redoubled, every one of which made an impression on our hearts. In a moment the planks, the channel, the basin, even our favorite willow, all were plowed up, nor was one word pronounced during this terrible transaction, except the above-mentioned exclamation. "An aqueduct!" repeated he, while destroying all our hopes. "An aqueduct! An aqueduct!" It may be supposed this adventure had a still more melancholy end for the young architects. This, however, was not the case. The affair ended here. Mr. Lambercier never reproached us on this account, nor was his countenance clouded with a frown. We even heard him mention the circumstance to his sister with loud bursts of laughter. The laugh of Mr. Lambercier might be heard to a considerable distance. But what is still more surprising, after the first transport of sorrow had subsided, we did not find ourselves violently afflicted. We planted a tree in another spot, and frequently recollected the catastrophe of the former, repeating with a significant emphasis, "An aqueduct! An aqueduct!" Till then, at intervals, I had fits of ambition, and could fancy myself Brutus or Aristides, but this was the first visible effect of my vanity. To have constructed an aqueduct with our own hands, to have set a slip of willow in competition with a flourishing tree, appeared to me a supreme degree of glory. I had a juster conception of it at 10 than Caesar entertained at 30. The idea of this walnut tree, with the little anecdotes it gave rise to, have so well continued, or returned to my memory, that the design which conveyed the most pleasing sensations, during my journey to Geneva, in the year 1754, was visiting Bossy, and reviewing the monuments of my infantine amusement, above all, the beloved walnut tree, whose age at that time must have been verging on a third of a century, but I was so beset with company that I could not find a moment to accomplish my design. There is little appearance now of the occasion being renewed, but should I ever return to that charming spot, and find my favorite walnut tree still existing, I am convinced I should water it with my tears. On my return to Geneva, I passed 2 or 3 years at my uncle's, expecting the determination of my friends respecting my future establishment. His own son, being devoted to genius, was taught drawing, and instructed by his father in the elements of Euclid. I partook of these instructions, but was principally fond of drawing. Meantime, they were irresolute, whether to make me a watchmaker, a lawyer, or a minister. I should have preferred being a minister, as I thought it must be a charming thing to preach, but the trifling income which had been my mother's, and was to be divided between my brother and myself, was too inconsiderable to defray the expense attending the prosecution of my studies. As my age did not render the choice very pressing, I remained with my uncle, passing my time with very little improvement, and paying pretty dear, though not unreasonably, for my board. My uncle, like my father, was a man of pleasure, but had not learned, like him, to abridge his amusements for the sake of instructing his family. Consequently our education was neglected. My aunt was a devotee, who loved singing psalms better than thinking of our improvement, so that we were left entirely to ourselves, which liberty we never abused. Ever inseparable, we were all the world to each other, and, feeling no inclination to frequent the company of a number of disorderly lads of our own age, we learned none of those habits of libertinism to which our idle life exposed us. Perhaps I am wrong in charging myself and cousin with idleness at this time, for, in our lives, we were never less so, and what was extremely fortunate, so incessantly occupied with our amusements, that we found no temptation to spend any part of our time in the streets. We made cages, pipes, kites, drums, houses, ships, and bows, spoiled the tools of my good old grandfather by endeavoring to make watches in imitation of him, but our favorite amusement was wasting paper, in drawing, washing, coloring, etc. There came an Italian mountebank to Geneva, called Gambercorda, who had an exhibition of puppets, that he made play a kind of comedy. We went once to see them, but could not spare time to go again, being busily employed in making puppets of our own and inventing comedies, which we immediately set about making them perform, mimicking to the best of our abilities the uncouth voice of Punch, and, to complete the business, my good aunt and Uncle Bernard had the patience to see and listen to our imitations, but my uncle, having one day read an elaborate discourse to his family, we instantly gave up our comedies, and began composing sermons. These details, I confess, are not very amusing, but they serve to demonstrate that the former part of our education was well directed, since being, at such an early age, the absolute masters of our time, we found no inclination to abuse it, and so little in want of other companions, that we constantly neglected every occasion of seeking them. When taking our walks together, we observed their diversions without feeling any inclination to partake of them. Friendship so entirely occupied our hearts, that, pleased with each other's company, the simplest pastimes were sufficient to delight us. We were soon remarked for being thus inseparable, and what rendered us more conspicuous, my cousin was very tall, myself extremely short, so that we exhibited a very whimsical contrast. This meager figure, small, sallow countenance, heavy air, and supine gait, excited the ridicule of the children, who, in the gibberish of the country, nicknamed him Barna Bread Anna, and we no sooner got out of doors than our ears were assailed with a repetition of Barna Bread Anna. He bore this indignity with tolerable patience, but I was instantly for fighting. This was what the young rogues aimed at. I engaged accordingly, and was beat. My poor cousin did all in his power to assist me, but he was weak, and a single stroke brought him to the ground. I then became furious, and received several smart blows, some of which were aimed at Barna Bread Anna. This quarrel so far increased the evil, that, to avoid their insults, we could only show ourselves in the streets while they were employed at school. I had already become a redresser of grievances, there only wanted a lady in the way to be a knight-errant in form. This defect was soon supplied, I presently had two. I frequently went to see my father at Nyon, a small city in the Vaudois country, where he was now settled. Being universally respected, the affection entertained for him extended to me, and, during my visits, the question seemed to be, who should show me most kindness. A Madame de Volson, in particular, loaded me with caresses, and, to complete all, her daughter made me her gallant. I need not explain what kind of gallant a boy of 11 must be to a girl of 22. The artful hussies know how to set these puppets up in front, to conceal more serious engagements. On my part, one saw no inequality between myself and Miss Volson, was flattered by the circumstance, and went into it with my whole heart, or rather my whole head, for this passion certainly reached no further, though it transported me almost to madness, and frequently produced scenes sufficient to make even a cynic expire with laughter.